Every once in a while, some narcissistic progressive wankers comes along and declares the end of capitalism. They do it so often, it's no longer news when they do it. It's pretty much like the end of the world predictions. Same loonies, same loony reasoning. But this time, a supposedly married Catholic capitalist declares the end of marriage, capitalism, and God. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Now, I don't usually read things from Salon, but the fact of the matter is that many people do read this rag, and with Salon's recent attempts to position itself as slightly more moderate, because, you know, championing pedophilia didn't quite work out that well, some may be misled and actually take this drivel as true. So, while the article is long, we will read all of it and debunk it point by point because the author makes incredibly wild claims that, if not thought of thoroughly, may indeed feel correct. And whenever something feels too good, it's probably bollocks. Anyway, buckle up because this one is going to be really long. So, without further ado, here it goes. Quote, "The next big thing isn't a clever gadget or miracle drug, it's a way of life. Not a breakthrough invention, but a social innovation. And it's not so much a beginning as it is a series of endings. Rising numbers of young people are now deciding to do everything their parents didn't. They're eschewing cultural and economic convention to challenge what we take to be civil society. They aren't marrying. They've become the refuseniks of our competitive corporate culture, and many of them have opted out of organized religion. Let's start with a quick look at some facts." Yes, give me facts. The end of marriage. According to the New York Times, over half of all American women under 30 who give birth are unmarried. When adjusted for levels of education and economics, the numbers skew dramatically higher. Of course, there are an array of possible causes for this trend, including everything from the relative economic independence of educated women to a shift away from the cultural stigma of unwed parentage to even a latent reaction to the divorce of their own parents. This change brings a complex array of challenges. For example, marriage is a foundational element of our legal system connected to property, beneficiary, and custodial rights and obligations. Some believe that the decline of matrimony has led to the increase of children living under the poverty level. These skeptics say that if we pull the thread of marriage from the fabric of our society, it is unclear what will unravel or remain intact. While societal norms may have changed, adjusting our legal system to protect unwed mothers and their children may still be far behind. But the end of marriage may also be a sign of something great. Just look at the Scandinavian countries, which rank among the highest educated in the world with a standard of living positioned well atop of our own, and you'll see the same downward trend for marriage among the young. Their society has not collapsed, their children are well attended, and by most discernible standards, they are prospering. Uh-oh, it's the bullshit alarm. Okay. That's enough. Sheesh. Okay, for starters, formerly educated is not, and is no longer actually really telling. You know, multiple employers and recruitment agencies have already ditched degree requirements, and far more are expected to do the same by the end of this decade. Why? Because nobody has yet been able to come up with conclusive evidence that if you filter out candidates without a degree, you get a more qualified pool of candidates. In fact, as time goes on, quite the opposite may indeed be true, since sane people avoid universities altogether if they cannot afford or simply aren't good enough for a degree in engineering, medicine, or some other field that actually matters. Meanwhile, the narcissistic pricks will go for the same old nonsense like gender studies, European studies, whiteness studies, or whatever studies. In other words, plain garbage. So, just because the Scandinavian nations are on paper the most educated, it doesn't really tell us anything in reality. In fact, most Scandinavians are far poorer than most Americans, and middle-class Swedes, for instance, actually have less living space than the top 2% poorest Americans. Now let that sink in. So, to say that Scandinavia's standard of living is well atop the one of the US is to simply lie, or be completely ignorant of actual reality. Also, it depends on how you define collapse, because as far as I'm concerned, Sweden is already somewhere around the collapse zone. Sadly, Sweden is no longer the high-trust society we used to know and appreciate. They're also no longer a homogeneous and libertine but still decent society, but rather a divided one. Denmark's population is the most indebted in the world, and when that bubble will explode, and it will, the 2008 crisis will look like a walk in the park in comparison to what's coming, at least for Denmark. Also, suicide amongst children is increasing all over Scandinavia, but particularly in Norway and Sweden. Whereas in Norway, 50 children kill themselves every year just because of their insane child protective services alone, which kidnaps 10,000 children every year, in Sweden the rise comes mostly from an increasingly unstable society, which resembles less and less to what they had been used to. So while Scandinavia has not yet descended into Venezuela or Honduras, to say that Scandinavia is prospering by most discernible standards is simply not true. Scandinavia is suffering, and I'm not saying this with any joy, but this Salon author has no idea whatsoever what he's talking about. Anyway, let's read some more. The end of capitalism. Well before the collapse of the middle-class economy in America, Europe, and now Asia, young people started cultural movements that shifted the center of balance from economics to social values. According to Pew Research, this change is creating an enormous generation gap between boomers and millennials that is still widening. It's likely a response to the worst employment prospects for young adults in almost a century, and the renewal of idealistic frontierism, with the new urban corridor as the 21st century Wild West. What were once areas of blight are now shining lights for our youth. Signs of the new anti-commercialism are everywhere: shared houses and cars, urban farm collectives, and the end of intellectual property rights. Millennial survival guides abound in the form of countless blogs that offer advice on how to hack the new world. Pass the beer nuts, comrade. What? So, millennials are in the worst economic prospects one could ever envision, and this is largely because of the selfishness of the boomers who voted en masse to increase the state and generally sabotage the society. Yet for some reason that's great because pass the beer nuts, comrade? Also, his Pew Research link says nothing about car sharing or house sharing. He quite literally pulled that out of his arse. More to the point, outside of what sane Americans rightfully call the People's Republic of Portlandia, the so-called urban farm collectives aren't popular or common at all, and will not be anytime soon, if ever. Maybe it has something to do with their dubious, next to non-existent economic success? Maybe. As for the end of intellectual property rights, where is this guy living? If anything, intellectual property rights have widened, at least in enforcement, when compared to 15 years ago. Anyway, let's read some more. The Time magazine went so far as to call millennials the me generation. While tons of readers disapproved of the essay's snarky tone, what the essay really missed is the collaborative nature of this age group. There is a noticeable shift away from traditional careers in favor of value-centric goals of communal harmony. For example, a much larger percentage of recent college graduates now seek work in the non-profit sector than graduates in the previous 4 decades. Many might have attributed this to the dismal job market or the availability of posh parental support, but this global, inclusive view of millennials suggests a real change in attitudes about what constitutes meaningful work. Look, even if all of that is true, that doesn't make it a good thing. A change in attitudes about what constitutes meaningful work is not in and of itself a good thing or a bad thing. You know, by 1850s standards, pressing some buttons in a room did not constitute meaningful work. But with the rise of advanced medical technology, for instance, pressing some buttons in a room can detect diseases earlier and save countless of lives. Highly meaningful work, methinks. But this also goes the other way around. By 1850 standards, writing gibberish propaganda about how oppressed you are by institutionalized intersectional systems of oppression did not constitute meaningful work at all. And here's the catch. It still doesn't constitute meaningful work. The fact that a much larger percentage of recent graduates now seek work in the non-profit sector than graduates in the previous 4 decades does not mean at all that this is progress. In fact, from an economic standpoint, it really isn't. But then again, we must also remember that just because it's called the non-profit sector, it doesn't mean there are no profits involved. The SPLC, for instance, is a non-profit but a highly profitable institution, thanks to the large swaths of gullible fools willing to pay for their disdainful agitprop. Same goes for the National Organization for Women, Planned Parenthood, or the TED Talks Foundation. There's plenty of profit there. So in that regard, this Salon author's point is irrelevant, since in reality, working in the non-profit sector is in many ways pretty much the same as working in the for-profit sector. But in general, a steep rise in non-profit work is not a good sign. At all. Think about it. We can't all work in non-profits. Profit is what brings the progress necessary for the Salon pricks to write their drivel. Anyway, let's read further. The end of God. According to the Washington Post, 25% of millennials don't affiliate with a faith-based tradition and almost twice as many don't belong to a church. More so, a Pew Research study suggests that an astonishingly low number of youth believe in the existence of a God. As religious participation, affiliation, and even belief wane in both post-Christian Europe and the Americas, atheism is now amongst the fastest-growing affiliation among young adults who have turned anti-faith into its own kind of faith. Now with this one, either the article is poorly edited, something which I would not entirely dismiss, or the author is really writing in bad faith. Now let's take this phrase again. Atheism is now among the fastest growing affiliations among young adults who have turned anti-faith into its own kind of faith. Now if we take the charitable interpretation, the author merely meant to say that young adults made being unfaithful to a deity a form of faith in itself. However, if we take it at face value, what he means is that a rise in overt anti-theism is somehow a good thing, especially if it's organized. And that's insane, if he means this. Now look, I'm as atheist as they come, but I tend to get along the least with my fellow atheists precisely because for them atheism is their religion, whereas for me, atheism is simply the fact that I don't believe in supernatural beings at all, be they metaphorical, spiritual, or whatever. I just don't need any of that. As a result, I simply ignore religion as long as it leaves me alone, which is why I rarely, if ever, have conflicts with Christianity, Buddhism, or Judaism. However, Islam tends to refuse to leave me alone and, unlike other religions, also commands its followers to behead atheists, as only the people of the book, that would be the Jews and the Christians, get the privilege of being offered a conversion or a life as a jizya-paying dhimmi. You see, even dhimmitude is too good for godless kuffar like me. As a result, I do go after Islam whenever it tries to impose itself upon me and my people. Sorry, I said my people. I hope that doesn't offend anyone, since caring about your people is now a bit obsolete at best and downright a crime in some jurisdictions. Now, you will forgive my excesses. Anyway, let's read further. What has driven our youth away from their spiritual traditions in record numbers at record speed? A recent report from progressive think tank Center for American Progress suggests a culture gap. The organization characterizes this gap as both a push away from church dogma regarding same-sex marriage and reproductive rights and a pull towards science and personal development. Now stop right there. Can anyone tell me which science supports same-sex marriage? What are the scientific underpinnings of the fundamentally political position of altering huge bodies of law to get gay marriage going? Last time I checked, science is concerned on whether homosexuality is genetic or not, and the evidence is slowly tilting the balance towards the position that it is not genetic. That's what science is concerned with, not with marriage of any kind. Also, let's cut the crap. There is no such thing as reproductive rights, because that would imply serious discussions about paternity fraud, or debtor's prison through fraudulent child support orders, and things of that nature. What the author really means is the imaginary right of women to get abortions whenever they want, regardless of gestational stage or their own age, and without any parental consent or spousal input, because her body, her choice, but never her responsibility, because that's heresy. And even on this topic, the field studying it, called bioethics, is still far from a conclusion. The jury is still out, as Americans would say, on that question. What we do know is that the fetuses up until the 3rd month in the gestational stage don't have a nervous system, and from a bioethical standpoint, if we are to have legalized abortion, it should be limited to 10 to 14 weeks of pregnancy, which leads to most of Europe having legislation precisely like that. Yet supposedly regressive and dogma-driven America, as American leftists like to characterize the nation to which they owe everything, America actually has far more permissive policies on this issue. I guess no one told the leftists in there that on the issue of abortion they should probably tone down the "make us more like Europe" rhetoric. Also, this author's argument seems to rely on the premises that pro-life atheists don't exist. Yet they do. None other than Christopher Hitchens was a pro-life atheist. You want to bet that most atheists didn't know that either? I'll also leave in the description box a link to the secular/atheist case against abortion. Now, I'm not going to argue any of the positions now, but I am letting you know that there is such thing as a secular pro-life argument. And it isn't so unpopular either. What I'm trying to say here is that this guy tries to make the same old tired and fundamentally flawed argument that any step outside of any sort of church dogma automatically means adherence to most, if not all, of the far-left ideological points. This is a widely held view, yet nonetheless wrong. I'm old enough to remember the times when being a right-wing atheist made me, or anyone else, a unicorn. But times have changed, and now there's Douglas Murray, a right-wing gay atheist, who's making the strongest case for Western civilization and against mass Islamic immigration or other ills that are currently challenging the American and European way of life. Anyway, let's read further. Abuses by clergy and power plays by the bully pulpit may also factor into this divide. Okay, fair enough. Even evangelical magazine Relevant notes that social media savvy millennials are increasingly rejecting the hierarchy of the church and turning to each other for spiritual solace and advice. Though they may not be attending traditional services, they might well be creating their own personalized spiritual playlist. This is certainly not the first time we've seen this combination of individualism and communitarianism. This was, after all, the basis for American progressivism in the early 20th century, but the institutional constructs that formerly served as bridges for diverse peoples with varied views are now impassable and separate us. Translation: whereas social media savvy millennials are rejecting the hierarchy of the church, they're not actually rejecting the concept of God or religion itself in such high droves as the progressives would have you believe. They're just simply turning to different forms of religion. Look, for all we know, religion, or better said, one's propensity towards following a religion, may actually be an evolutionary adaptation of man. I'm not saying it's definitely so, but surely it does look like that. Most of the so-called atheists you see actually do believe in other forms of religion, such as Reiki, healing through energies, or a plethora of other pseudo-scientific nonsense which, in my view, is far more harmful than Christianity has ever been in US's recent history, or in Europe's recent history for that matter. The belief in pseudo-scientific nonsense or religiously self-reinforced conspiracy theories leads the most progressive among us to incredibly dumb decisions, such as refusing to vaccinate one's children. And if we look closely on some maps, we'll notice that anti-vaccine beliefs permeate the most posh and progressive areas, where people tend to self-identify as atheists or free thinkers a lot more than other areas. Again, I'm not saying there aren't traditional religious people who reject vaccines. They sure do exist, but as a prevalence, idiotic and self-evidently false beliefs about Big Pharma are more present in middle and upper middle class areas filled with free thinkers. To sum up this argument, just because one has renounced God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, that in itself does not an atheist make. So, let's read further. Told you this is going to be long. Quote, "Why is this happening and what does it mean?" Some social theorists suggest that this transition is merely the 21st century version of the same irrational exuberance we saw in the late 1920s and 1960s. They often frame these transitions as the adolescent stage of a grand cycle of divergence and convergence. This explanation implies that we should just let the cycle run its course and things will return to normal. In reality, though, boundless connectivity has changed the way we integrate our lived experience with our interpretation of those experiences and has created a new type of normal. With all these connective technologies, from smartphones to social media to translational technologies, we're getting a wider view, but that view is through a smaller lens. Now that doesn't really make any sense, but anyway, the peer-to-peer nature of contemporary communication appears to be horizontal, democratic, and inclusive, yet all of these smaller communities also result in exclusion. An exclusion from broader forms of sense-making. In other words, we have all of these micro-segments and there is little consensus. There is no grand worldview that we all share, rather there are personalized worldviews. So there you go. So our leftist friend here is disturbed by the fact that there is little consensus and far more personalized views. I mean, weren't you the champions of diversity, people? What's the matter? Has diversity become too problematic for you? The fact of the matter is that this author and many others like him are deeply concerned by the fact that an increasing number of youngsters fundamentally reject their worldview. You see, diversity is good as long as there's diverse ways of left-wing persuasion. Once there's some diversity that cuts right through the narrative, then it's suddenly bad and wider view through a small lens, to quote our Salon author. But let's go further, because here he actually makes a semi-decent argument. Quote, Max Weber, a founder of the field of sociology, anticipated the situation over 100 years ago, when he suggested that the disintegration of socially ascribed roles would lead to the decline of integrating institutions and the rise of extreme individualism. This would create a polemic of horizontal pluralism, the absence of a unifying perspective to integrate values except for a nominal all-encompassing view. Weber's vision for the future is not so far off from today's reality. Without marriage, capitalism, and God providing a nexus to integrate our common experience and interpretation, We lack a common identity or sense of purpose. We has become a collective me. Now, to an extent, I have to agree. Though again, only up to an extent, because this view is neglecting some serious aspects of reality. For starters, neither the United States nor the world at large is living without capitalism. In fact, quite the opposite is true. While indeed the level of economic freedom in the United States has declined in the last 15 to 20 years, it has not yet declined to damaging levels, and the overall level of global economic freedom has indeed substantially increased. Places that were merely a generation ago essentially unabashed shitholes such as Honduras, Nigeria, Senegal, most of Eastern Europe, Bangladesh, and many other places now have thriving industries and standards of living simply unimaginable when most present-day millennials were born in these countries. You go walk the streets of Krakow and talk about the end of capitalism and God. You'll be laughed out of the city in no time. Or, since this author is focused on the United States, you can try go walking on the streets of Houston and talk nonsense like that. See how that goes. On the other hand, as I was saying, I have to agree with this Salon author to an extent. Indeed, in order for a society to continue to exist, it does need some common ground, and indeed, if you eliminate God, or at least the tradition of Christianity, that does tend to lead to some fragmentation and the weakening of the social fabric. But it doesn't have to be that way. An example that comes to mind is Czech Republic, where the most numerous religious group is formed by those who don't declare any religion, followed by those who declare themselves as non-religious or atheist. Less than a third of the country is Christian, while other religions simply don't exist. Islam is somewhere at around 0.02%, and other non-Christian religions are even lower than that. Yet things didn't go wrong in the Czech Republic, but you see, in the Czech Republic, critical theory and similar nonsense is openly discussed and routinely mocked, I might add, on talk shows in the evening on TV. Everyone also in Czech Republic is expected to speak the Czech language, and when you walk the street of Czech cities and towns, the place is beautiful and, very important, homogeneous. In other words, they still have a high-trust society, even without God. Now the question is, can this model be replicated on a much bigger scale and on a much bigger and far more diverse nation like the United States? And from where I'm looking, the answer seems to be no. Because there are fewer other unifying factors nowadays in the United States thanks to the constant erosion of the Constitution, which was supposed to be the unifying factor and indeed was until things started going wrong. Anyway, a few more paragraphs. Is this the end of marriage, capitalism, and God? Yes and no. Yes, because more and more people are not only opting out of these institutions, they're actively positioning themselves against them. How the hell do you opt out of capitalism? Anyway, no, because no matter how many alternatives arise, there will always be a need for family units, meritocracy, and the belief in something more than the self. The irony is that the people who love these institutions and belief systems most are the parents of the people who are rejecting these institutions today. Boomers were so focused on personal liberty and freedom that they forgot to clear a middle way for their children. In place of the collective sense of destiny that bound mid- and late 20th century Americans together are individualized acts of compassion and self-actualization. Rather than furthering a greater good like curing a disease or putting a man on the moon, millennials are furthering a greater personal good. This isn't to say that young people are selfish. In fact, the opposite is true. Organizations like Habitat for Humanity and Teach for America give people the chance to help others and cultivate themselves in the process. It's a powerful combination of altruism and personal development. Our pieces are now our wholeness. In the face of the fragmentation everywhere, our next generations of creators and thinkers are finding themselves and inspiring other people to do so around them. Does this author use the internet? Is he ever leaving his ivory tower? I'm compelled to think that he doesn't, because otherwise he wouldn't be writing nonsense like this. Let me quote this one again. This isn't to say that young people are selfish. In fact, the opposite is true. The opposite is true? Really? American youngsters are the most narcissistic group on the planet, with a likelihood 10 times higher than 3 generations ago to be narcissistic, or 8 times higher. Depends which studies you read. In fact, the huge levels of narcissism in today's young people is contested by exactly nobody in the field that studies mental health. What is being contested these days is the list of reasons. There is no consensus, for now, as to why young people of today are so far more likely to be narcissistic than previous generations. So, if anything, young people today are far more selfish, not more altruistic, as this author wrongfully asserts. Also, make no mistake, I'm not making a value judgment yet, but the Salon author simply has the facts wrong, as he kept on having throughout this article. Anyway, final 2 paragraphs. Quote, marriage, capitalism, and God will persist, but they'll reappear in new guises, grand forces on a more personalized, intimate scale. The key concept here is hybridity, mixtures of old institutions and innovative values. Marriage with more flexibility and wider definitions, economic systems that defy categorization like microfinancing and bitcoins, and religions that are mashups of ancient traditions and 21st century personal development practices, from spiritual yoga to psychotherapy to eco-goddess worship. In reality, though, we can only speculate so much. The truth is that we're moving into uncharted territory, and we need to become okay with that. We all want to see the future, it's in our nature, but we simply cannot. The fundamental difficulty of innovation is that we have no data on what's to come. It's a perennial frustration, yet it's also a source of vast possibility. We need to let go of traditional structures and allow for boundaries to loosen up and break down. A married Catholic capitalist, I may seem like the quintessence of the old guard, but with my judgment suspended and my mind opened, I'm not just ready for everything I know to be dismantled, I'm excited for it. And you should be, too. Well, I have to appreciate this author's honesty when he admits that he has his judgment suspended, because only someone who intentionally shuts down his brain can write such a drivel and still think that's a good thing. As for open-mindedness, that's fine up to a point, and the point being when your brains start falling out. On a broader point, he is correct in the last 2 paragraphs. God, capitalism, and marriage will persist even if under slightly different forms, but this admission pretty much wipes the floor with the rest of his article. Where I have to take issue is with his appeal to let go of traditional structures and allow for boundaries to loosen up and break down, because surely that always went down very well, hasn't it? I mean, Europe allowed its external boundaries to loosen up and break down just a few months, and now we've gotten ourselves a long-term migrant crisis, and that's only one boundary. The reality is that this push to let go of anything traditional so willy-nilly isn't exactly a sound approach to anything, really, let alone public policy and social structures. Some ideas are good and have indeed passed the test of time and have been proven to be overall positive trade-offs. And here we can include things like the traditional family, which both old wisdom and new wisdom proves conclusively that it's a net benefit for the individual children and for the society at large. Other ideas are generally good, but they could be improved, such as the sex roles. Whereas we can now loosen a bit the pressure on both sexes and their roles thanks to technological progress enabled by capitalism, we also need to understand that such thing was not possible 100 years ago. So instead of going full retard or full feminist, but I would be repeating myself, and invent nonsensical ideas like gender and then start crusades against gender roles, we can instead slowly admit, for instance, that it's okay for stay-at-home fathers to exist, while maintaining what we know to be true, namely that child rearing works best if at least a stay-at-home parent is around, rather than a nanny or, worse, nobody. And then there are some ideas who are indeed obsolete, such as allowing the church sway and access into the state institutions. But here's the catch. There are also newer ideas that we should be ready to admit they're downright wrong, no matter how good they feel, such as the nonsensical idea that Finland and Italy are about the same, which is the raw premise of the political union commonly known as the European Union, or the idea that subsidizing single parenthood is somehow empowering. Seriously, it isn't. And when you subsidize something, you get more of that, not less. Anyway, I've been going on for quite a long, so maybe I should stop here. So, with that being said, thank you for watching and supporting this channel. See you soon on Freedom Alternative.